She set the last fork down, stepped back from the table, and did not know that 50 years later, a stranger would be filming it. The rules she followed by heart are gone, but every one of them still works. This was a Tuesday in a brand new subdivision outside Philadelphia, the kind of house with a picture window and a driveway still smelling of fresh asphalt. Inside, a young homemaker was hosting her husband's co-workers for the first time, and every choice she made that night, where the forks went, who sat next to whom, when the drinks came out, followed a system nobody had to explain to her twice. She had absorbed it from her mother, from magazines, from Emily Post herself. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Etiquette books, the kind your grandmother kept on a shelf next to her cookbooks, were not stuffy relics even then. They were the operating manual for an entire generation of women building a social life from scratch, in houses their own mothers had never lived in neighborhoods that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. The most famous of those manuals belonged to a woman born in 1872, a full generation before the houses she was writing for even existed. Emily Post published her first edition of Etiquette in 1922, and by the time post-war families were unpacking boxes in their new split levels, she was revising it again, translating rules built for Gilded Age drawing rooms into something a 26-year-old in a ranch house could actually use on a Tuesday night. By the 1950s, Post had a rival, and her name was Amy Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt published her own complete book of etiquette in 1952, and despite the grand-sounding surname, she was a working journalist, not old money. She represented something newer, manners delivered through newspaper columns and eventually television, built for a generation that wanted the rules without the aristocratic weight behind them. Between the two of them, Post and Vanderbilt shaped how an entire generation set a table, greeted a guest, and ended an evening. But the rules did not stay locked inside hardcover books. They spread through Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and House Beautiful, magazines that landed in mailboxes every month with photographed table settings a homemaker could copy exactly. The ritual was never written down on any single guest's dinner plate, but every good hostess knew it by heart the moment she sat down. Tonight we are going back through 7 of those vanished tricks, the ones etiquette books spelled out in careful detail and modern life quietly let go of. Every one of them still solves a real problem. You just have to remember how they worked. Trick number 1 starts at the edge of the plate. In a house in Ohio, a mother was showing her 12-year-old daughter how to lay a table for company, and she wasn't just arranging silverware, she was teaching a code. Outside in. Whatever utensil sits farthest from the plate gets used first, and by the time dessert arrives, nobody has had to ask a single question all night. Here's how the full layout worked. Forks sat to the left, arranged in the order they'd be used outside to inside. Knives went to the right with the blade turned in toward the plate, spoons beside them, bread plate up at the left with a small butter knife laid across it, water goblet just above the knife, and the wine glass positioned to its right. It looks complicated until you realize it is self-explaining. Nobody at that table needed a diagram. A guest could walk into a stranger's dining room, sit down in front of 5 pieces of unfamiliar silverware, and know exactly what to do without asking a single question, because the table itself was giving the instructions. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and it still solves the exact same problem it solved 70 years ago. It is worth pausing on why this mattered so much in this particular decade. Roughly 13 million new homes went up across the United States in the 1950s, and home ownership climbed from about 55% at the start of the decade to somewhere near 62% by its end. That is millions of new dining rooms, filled with new china, hosting people who had never eaten together before. Levittown, New York, is the place most historians point to first. Built starting in 1947, it sold young families an entire life in a box. Cape Cod and ranch-style houses with a dining area already assumed into the floor plan. Period photographs show these houses staged with breakfronts full of good china before the family had even finished unpacking the moving truck. So the outside-in rule was not decoration. It was infrastructure for a country that was, quite literally, building its social life from an empty lot. A young couple with no family china pattern of their own, no inherited silver, could still walk into any dining room in America that decade and read the table like a familiar language, because the language had been standardized on purpose. Trick number 2 happened before a single guest arrived, and it happened at a desk, not a table. A hostess in a Chicago suburb sat down with a stack of small cards and a guest list of 10, and she was not just deciding who sat where. She was running an experiment on her own dinner party, and she had been trained to run it well. Both Post and Vanderbilt were explicit about the logic. Husbands and wives were seated apart on purpose because couples talk to each other constantly at home, and the entire reason for the dinner party was to make everyone talk to someone new. It sounds backwards to modern ears. It was actually the whole point. The seating chart went further than that. A good hostess also avoided putting two talkers side by side because they would monopolize each other and leave the rest of the table silent, and she avoided pairing two quiet guests for the same reason in reverse. This was not guesswork. It was a small piece of social engineering worked out at a desk days before anyone walked through the door. Place cards became standard for any dinner of 8 or more, specifically to prevent the awkward shuffle of guests standing in a doorway unsure where to sit. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact same problem every modern wedding planner solves with a seating chart taped to an easel. They just never learned it started at somebody's dining table. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the seating chart is a perfect example. Nobody frames it as an invention. It just quietly disappeared from home entertaining once dinner parties shrank down to whoever happened to be free that night, and the careful architecture of who sits where went with it. Trick number 3 began the morning after the party, not the night of it. A young wife in Atlanta woke up, made coffee, and before she did anything else, sat down to write a letter. Not a text, not a phone call the next time she happened to think of it. A letter, mailed that same day, thanking her hostess for the evening before. This was called the bread and butter note, and it was not optional politeness. It carried real social weight. Etiquette manuals treated it as mandatory as the original invitation, ideally mailed within 24 hours of the party, because a hostess who never heard a word of thanks had every reason to quietly leave that guest off her list next time. Think about what that note actually did. It closed the loop. The hostess spent days planning, hours cooking, and an entire evening managing a room full of people, and the note was proof that all of it had landed, that someone had noticed the effort and would remember it. Without it, hosting became a one-way transaction. With it, it became a relationship. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and it costs almost nothing to bring back. A short note, sent the next day, does something a text message buried in a group chat simply cannot do. It says, out loud, in ink, that the evening mattered enough to sit down and say so. Trick number 4 is the one this channel gets asked about the most, and it happened at 6 o'clock sharp in living rooms across the country. The cocktail hour was not a suggestion. It was a scheduled transition. A full 60 minutes built into the evening between guests arriving and dinner actually being served. The furniture itself tells you how seriously families took it. What used to be called a tea wagon got quietly repurposed into a bar cart, wheeled out from a corner of the living room the moment guests arrived, stocked with shakers, jiggers, and an ice bucket. As suburban homeownership expanded through the decade, this small piece of furniture became almost as common as the television set beside it. What mattered was not what was in the glass. It was what the hour was for. 60 minutes of standing, moving, and talking to whoever was nearest, before anyone sat down and the conversation locked into place for the rest of the meal. It softened the transition from strangers on a doorstep to people who had actually spoken to each other by the time dinner began. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home before anyone sat down to eat, and that hour was how she did it. Modern gatherings tend to skip straight from doorbell to dinner table, and something genuinely gets lost in that shortcut, the slow warm-up that turned a group of separate arrivals into a single evening. Trick number 5 is easy to get wrong, so let's clear something up first. If you've heard that fondue parties were a signature 1950s trick, that is a common mix-up worth correcting. Fondue's real American boom came in the mid-1960s, pushed along by the Swiss pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair, not the decade we're covering tonight. So trick 5 is something quieter and genuinely from this decade, the rule about what a guest brought through the front door. A guest never arrived empty-handed. Flowers, a small box of chocolates, or a bottle of liqueur were the standard offering, and etiquette writers were very specific about one thing: never bring cut flowers that need immediate arranging. That single rule tells you everything about how carefully these women thought about hosting. Cut flowers seem thoughtful, but they hand the hostess a new job at the exact moment she has none left to give, finding a vase, trimming stems, filling water, all while guests are arriving and dinner is on the stove. A prearranged gift, or nothing that needs assembly, was the actual kindness. The ritual was never written down on the invitation, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and every good guest knew it too. Showing up empty-handed was not neutral. It read as an oversight. Showing up with the wrong kind of gift was almost as bad. The etiquette of arriving well was a skill in itself. Trick 6 takes us back further than the 1950s, into a tradition that was already fading by the time our hostesses were setting their tables, but that they still knew about, the way you know your great-grandmother's maiden name without ever having met her. The calling card. In the decades before the 1950s, a lady paying a social call who found nobody home would leave an engraved card with the household servant or set it on a card tray by the door. 1950s, etiquette manuals still explained the rules, especially for formal introductions and condolence calls, particularly in more traditional households in the South and older northeastern cities. Here is the detail almost nobody alive remembers. Calling cards had a folded corner code. A turned-down corner meant the card had been delivered in person, not sent by mail or handed off through a servant. It was a wordless signal, a tiny fold that said, "I stood on this porch myself." By the time our 1950s hostess was setting her table, this practice was already history, more legacy knowledge in the back of an etiquette book than something she did every week. But it is worth remembering, not because you should start folding calling cards today, but because it proves something bigger. Every ritual we're covering tonight was itself standing on the shoulders of an older one. The parlor remembers, even when we forget. And the calling card is proof of just how deep that memory runs. Rituals do not vanish all at once. They fade in layers, one generation quietly setting aside what the last one considered essential, until eventually only the etiquette books remember it happened at all. Trick 7 is the one that would horrify most modern group chats. When a formal invitation arrived at a 1950s household, the etiquette rule was simple and unforgiving. Reply within 24 hours, and reply in the same medium the invitation came in. A written invitation earned a written reply. No exceptions, no waiting to see who else was going. Think about what that speed actually protected. A hostess could not plan a menu, buy the right amount of food, or arrange her seating chart if half her guest list was still deciding 2 days before the party. The fast reply was not just politeness toward the host, it was the mechanism that made every other trick on this list even possible. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and honestly, It might be the most useful trick on this entire list for anyone hosting today. A group of friends waiting on one slow reply in a group chat is the exact same problem a 1950s hostess would never have tolerated for more than a day. Let's step back and look at the shape of the whole decade, because these 7 tricks did not appear all at once, and they did not vanish all at once either. The story starts earlier than most people assume, and it ends later too. Go back to the 1920s and 30s and you find the roots of it all, calling cards and formal visiting rituals still very much alive among the upper and upper middle classes, and Emily Post's first edition already trying to teach a growing American middle class how to behave in rooms their parents had never been invited into. Then the war came. Between 1941 and 1945, rationing and a shortage of household help suppressed formal entertaining almost entirely. Sugar, alcohol, and even certain foods were rationed, and hosting shrank down to potlucks and make-do gatherings. The elaborate rituals did not disappear. They went dormant, waiting for a reason to come back. The reason came back fast. Returning soldiers, the GI Bill, and a housing boom that broke ground almost overnight brought the old rituals surging back, now dressed up as a symbol of prosperity and normalcy after years of sacrifice. Levittown broke ground in 1947, and formal entertaining came roaring back right alongside it. The years right in the middle of the decade, roughly 1954 through 1957, were the true peak of everything we've covered tonight. Matched china, the cocktail hour, hostess gifts, place cards, even the last traces of calling card etiquette in more traditional households, all of it running at full strength at the same time in the most affordable new housing relative to income America had ever built. And then, quietly, in the very last years of the decade, something started competing for the room. Television ownership crossed somewhere near 85 to 90% of American households by the late 1950s, and the glowing box in the corner began pulling attention away from the parlor conversation it had once shared the room with peacefully. It would be easy to blame the television for everything that came next, but that is too simple, and this channel does not deal in simple villains. The real unraveling took another 2 decades to happen, through the 1960s and 70s, as more women entered full-time work, divorce rates climbed, and the rigid architecture of the formal dinner party slowly gave way to something looser. Let's clear up one more misconception while we're on this timeline, because it gets repeated constantly. TV dinners did not kill the dinner party in the 1950s. Swanson introduced its TV dinner in 1953, but it was marketed for casual weeknight family meals, not for entertaining company. The formal ritual and the quick family supper lived side by side for years, before one eventually crowded out the other. Here is a misconception worth sitting with a little longer, because it changes how you should feel about all of this. It is tempting to say the 1950s dinner party was effortless because women simply did not work. That is not true, and it undersells exactly what these women accomplished every single week. Many post-war homemakers had far less domestic help than their own mothers had, because servants became genuinely rare for the middle class after the war ended. What looked effortless on the night of the party was the product of days of planning, menus mapped out in advance, shopping schedules, components prepared ahead of time so the evening itself could look easy. That is the real story hiding under all 7 of these tricks. Not effortless grace handed down from a simpler time, but genuine craft, engineered by women managing more of the labor themselves than the generation before them, and still choosing to make the evening feel like it cost nothing at all. Let's talk about one more misconception, and it cuts the other direction. It is just as wrong to imagine that every single household in America followed Emily Post to the letter every night of the week. Etiquette manuals described an ideal, an aspiration, especially appealing to a middle class eager to prove it belonged in its brand new house. The actual lived reality varied enormously by region, by class, by background. A farm family in Nebraska and a corporate wife in a Connecticut suburb were not running the same evening, even if they owned the same etiquette book. What we are covering tonight is the aspirational standard, the version careful hostesses reached for, not a photograph of every kitchen table in America. That nuance matters because it is easy to romanticize the past into a golden age that never quite existed, and just as easy to dismiss it as a stiff, joyless performance nobody actually enjoyed. The truth sits in between. These were real rules, followed imperfectly by real women, in service of something they genuinely believed in, making an ordinary evening feel like it mattered. Let's meet the woman who wrote the rulebook a little more closely, because her own story is stranger than most people realize. Emily Post was born in 1872 into a world of horse-drawn carriages, and by the time she was revising etiquette for post-war readers, she was in her late 70s and early 80s, writing for houses she would have found almost unrecognizable as a young woman. Think about what that means. The voice teaching a ranch house generation how to entertain was an elderly woman born before the telephone existed, translating rules built for 19th century drawing rooms into instructions a 26-year-old newlywed in a split level could actually follow. That gap, between who wrote the rules and who was using them, is one of the strangest and most touching details in this entire story. Post ran an institute, wrote a syndicated newspaper column, and even hosted a radio program in the 1930s and 40s. By the time she passed away in 1960, she had spent nearly 4 decades as the single most recognized authority on American manners, and her family carried the book forward under her daughter-in-law Elizabeth Post for decades after. Amy Vanderbilt's story runs on a different track entirely, and it is worth knowing because she represents something Post never quite could. Vanderbilt was a journalist first, and her 1952 book became an instant rival because it spoke in a more modern voice, later expanding into a television program and a syndicated column of her own. Between an elderly establishment authority and a modern media-savvy journalist, post-war households essentially had two competing prophets of the same religion, both preaching the same core belief, that a well-run home was a form of respect, both for your guests and for yourself. It wasn't only books doing the teaching, though. Betty Crocker, a corporate persona rather than a real woman, issued advice pamphlets and cookbooks through the decade that blended recipes with informal, entertaining tips, quietly shaping norms through advertising as much as any etiquette author ever did. This is worth remembering the next time you flip through a vintage magazine and see a perfectly styled table setting. That photograph was not neutral information. It was General Mills or a magazine advertiser quietly reinforcing exactly how a good homemaker was supposed to behave, one glossy page at a time. So by the mid-1950s, you had books, newspaper columns, radio, early television, and magazine advertising, all pointed at the same target, teaching an entire generation of new homeowners how to turn an empty dining room into a functioning social life. It is one of the most thorough pieces of cultural instruction America has ever run, and almost nobody talks about it that way. Let's go back to that house outside Philadelphia one more time, the one from the start of this video, and picture the whole evening from arrival to goodbye. The doorbell rings at 6. The bar cart is already stocked. An hour of conversation passes standing up, and only then does everyone move to a table where every fork is already exactly where it needs to be. Place cards guide everyone to a seat, engineered for good conversation. A gift, chosen with the flower rule in mind, is already sitting on the entry table. And somewhere in the back of every guest's mind is the knowledge that tomorrow morning, a note will go in the mail, because that is simply what a good guest does. None of it happened by accident, and none of it happened because these women had nothing better to do. Every single piece was chosen, taught, practiced, and repeated until it looked effortless, which is exactly what real craft looks like from the outside. The parlor remembers, even when we forget how much work it took to build it. So why does any of this matter now, in 2026, on a Tuesday night when most of us are far more likely to order takeout and eat it on the couch than set a table for company? Because something in us clearly still wants this. The evidence for that is everywhere if you know where to look. Vintage bar carts are back in living rooms that have nothing else 1950s about them. Coupe glasses, jiggers, and shakers sell steadily to people who have never once thrown a formal cocktail hour, because the aesthetic of that careful, unhurried transition still speaks to something modern life rarely offers. Emily Post's own institute still exists today, run by her descendants, still publishing updated guidance, still quoted regularly in modern lifestyle journalism. The name that once translated Gilded Age manners for a ranch house generation is still doing translation work, nearly a century later, for a generation raised on group chats and delivery apps. There is a real cultural conversation happening right now about loneliness, about the disappearance of what sociologists call third places, the informal gathering spots outside home and work where community used to happen. The formal dinner party was one of those places too, and its quiet disappearance is part of the same story people are only now starting to name out loud. That is not a call to feel guilty about a plate of takeout on the couch. It is worth being honest, though, about what that convenience quietly replaced. A structured evening, a table that explained itself, a note the next morning proving the whole thing mattered. None of those things are gone because they stopped working. They are gone because nobody scheduled the hour for them anymore. You do not need 13 million new homes or a subdivision outside Philadelphia to bring any of this back. You need one dinner, one guest list of 6 or 8, and the willingness to actually plan a seat for each person instead of leaving it to chance. Try the outside-in table setting once, and you will notice how much quieter the meal feels, how few questions get asked, how naturally it moves from course to course. Try the 24-hour reply rule the next time someone invites you to something, and watch how much it is appreciated, because almost nobody does it anymore. Write one thank you note after the next dinner someone hosts for you. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works exactly the way it did in that kitchen in Atlanta 70 years ago. The gesture has not aged a single day, even if almost everything around it has changed completely. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and every one of these 7 tricks was sitting quietly in a book on a shelf, waiting for someone to open it back up. Etiquette manuals were never about stiffness for its own sake. They were instructions for making people feel wanted, one carefully placed fork, one scheduled hour, one honest note at a time. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, not because it came naturally to her, but because she studied it, practiced it, and passed it down the way any real craft gets passed down. That house outside Philadelphia is long gone now, sold and resold a dozen times over. But the rules that filled it that Tuesday night are sitting right here, ready for you to use them. If tonight made you want to set a table the old way, or write one real letter instead of a text, that is exactly what this channel is here for. Subscribe if you want more of what the parlor remembers, and tell me in the comments which of these 7 tricks you are trying first. I will see you at the next dinner party.